Today is the last Sunday of the liturgical year, the last Sunday after Pentecost. You've sat through 26 of them this year, and you've made it to the last one. Some parts of our church call today's Sunday the Feast of Christ the King. The Feast of Christ the King is a feast that came into liturgical practice by the Catholics first in the 1920s, so it's a pretty recent feast. Protestants of different kinds have adopted it, liturgical Protestants anyway, have adopted it in the 1970s. And when the Protestant churches decided to celebrate the Feast of Christ the King on the last Sunday after Pentecost, they did that as a kind of witness to unity, even amidst denominational difference. So here on earth, we have lots of different flavors of Protestants. We have Lutherans, we have Methodists, we have Presbyterians, the list goes on. Basically, Protestantism is all about starting a new church when you don't like what your current church is doing. I don't recommend that, but there it is. And this Feast of Christ the King is meant to remind us that no matter what our differences of practice are, at the end of the day, we all share the same Lord, the same King in Jesus. In some parts of the church, that feast continues to be celebrated as Christ the King. But in other parts of the church, it's beginning to feel as though there might be some problems with that image of Christ the King. Because though I applaud the spirit of denominational unity that this feast was created to honor, I sometimes worry that in our quest for Christian unity, we are, of course, creating some challenges in the wider landscape of humanity. And I think nobody really knows at the end of time exactly how we will all come before the presence of the divine, the Almighty. And to speak of Christ the King as the eternal source of all judgment for all people in all places and at all times makes it hard to fully enter into interfaith conversations, interfaith reality, and honor the possibility of God's presence in faith traditions that aren't part of the Christian family. So, the substitute title for this feast is the Reign of Christ Sunday. It's not too different from Christ the King, but it takes the emphasis off of political systems of domination and leadership and onto being involved in the reign of Christ. So choosing to allow Christ to reign. Kind of a consent of the people to be governed thinking for those of us from New England here who enjoy that way of thinking, the consent of the people to be governed. When I think of the reign of Christ, I think of the reign of Christ both in two ways. One, in my own heart. I think about whether I'm going to allow the power of Christ, the values that his life embodied, values of service, of compassion, of justice, of self-giving and self-offering to reign, or whether there will be other values in my heart that will be allowed to reign. And I think we're all familiar with what some of the other ways of living in life are. Ways of selfishness, ways of being closed off to encounters with people who are new or different or other than us. Fear, scarcity. I think the reign of Christ invites us to think about Christ being allowed to rule our own hearts, in our own lives, in our own decision-making. And then, of course, we think of the reign of Christ as we pray for that to influence our collective decision-making as people, our collective decision-making as neighborhoods, as communities, as a commonwealth, as a country. How will we choose to govern ourselves together? What values do we expect our common life to reflect and represent? Are they the values of compassion, of generosity, of justice and equality, of love, of care, of concern for stranger as well as friend, enemy as well as ally? The phrase, the reign of Christ, is new to me. This is the first year we've celebrated in this way. I've just learned about this kind of other language for celebrating this holiday. And it's had me thinking this past week of another phrase involving the word reign. And that, unfortunately, is the phrase, the reign of terror. My French history isn't very good. I'm sure some of you have much better French history than I do. But the reign of terror comes from the French Revolution, a time when, for about 8 or 9 months in the middle of the revolution, which lasted almost a decade, there was this deep chaos, this deep uncertainty, and lack of trust that there would be safety, that there would be freedom, that there would be the opportunity to express what was on people's hearts and minds in an open way. The interim leaders of the country were all messed up and executing people for dissent and staging huge rallies, and it was just a very tense and awful time, so much so that it's been known as the Reign of Terror. And as all of us have turned our hearts and minds and probably too much of our television viewing towards what's been going on in Paris and in other places around the world in the past 10 days, I've been kind of thinking about, these attacks keep happening, right? It's like one thing after another. And I wonder what's the difference between an act of terror and a reign of terror. So I've been pondering that this week. And I think I found an answer that is a lot more hopeful than the question, because that question is not very hopeful. And here's my preliminary answer to this question. Acts of terror happen, and they're sad, and they're tragic, and they're totally disruptive, and they're deeply wrong. They make you cry. But for acts of terror to become a reign of terror, we have to let that happen. Because a reign of terror infects our hearts. It infects how we make choices in our lives. It affects whether we are going to respond to violence and tragedy and atrocity by closing ourselves off, by living in fear and scarcity, by abandoning the values which those who are being hostile are trying to attack. Are we going to say, we give up? We give up living a life of freedom. We give up living a life where we structure our lives around loving others, around taking care of our neighbors, around being compassionate towards those, whether we know them or whether they are strangers. The word reign comes from the word rule. It means to govern. The choice before all of us is what we will allow to govern us. What values will govern our hearts in this difficult, hard time? So I invite all of us to ponder that today, whether we are allowing the values of Christ's life on earth, his blessings from heaven, to rule in us, whether we can think of our commitment to generosity and compassion towards others as a stand against a different kind of reign that is attempting to make its presence known in this world. It's the only way I can think of to respond to this endless cycle of violent acts that seems to hit the news every few weeks now. I feel so strongly the need to respond to that, the need to set myself apart from that. And this is the only way I think I can do it, which is to let Christ rule in my heart, to not close myself off to that spirit of love and compassion and taking care of each other. That's the world I want my children to grow up in. It's the world I want to live in. And it's the world that the people I love and respect most have bequeathed to me in this time. And my call is to protect that spirit, to allow Christ to reign in my life and my heart, and to do whatever I can to help Christ's love and reconciling spirit be the spirit that reigns in my neighborhoods, my communities, my state, my nation, and this world. So as we celebrate Reign of Christ Sunday today, in the midst of a challenging global scenario, I invite you to remember that the act of coming to church, the act of having a relationship with God, the act of praying, the act of allowing your life to be transformed by that redeeming grace of Christ, that act is an act of protest against those who would try to offer a different reign for this world, against those who would try to encourage us to live in fear. to live in scorn, to live in rejection. And I pray that that Spirit of Christ may continue to dwell and rule within each of our hearts this day and all days. And for that, we give much thanks.